1:20 a.m., the 28th of September, 1994. The Baltic Sea is a churning cauldron of black water and white foam. Most of the 989 people aboard the MS Estonia are asleep, lulled by the rhythmic, heavy slamming of the hull against force 9 gales. They believe they are encased in 15,000 tons of state-of-the-art Finnish engineering. They are wrong. Deep within the steel marrow of the ship's bow, a mechanical murder is underway. The Estonia isn't just taking on water, it is being decapitated. In the next 4 minutes, a 55-ton block of steel, the bow visor, will tear away from the hull, exposing the open car deck to the fury of the sea. By the time the officers on the bridge realize the visor is missing, the ship will have already crossed the point of no mathematical return. To understand the final 4 minutes, the structural design of the bow must be examined. Unlike modern ferries that utilize clamshell doors which open sideways, the Estonia utilized a bow visor configuration. This design features a massive, aerodynamic nose that lifts upward on hinges to allow vehicles to drive onto the ramp. When the ship is at sea, this 55-ton visor is held in place by 3 critical components. 1. The Atlantic lock, a single heavy-duty hydraulic bolt located at the bottom center of the visor. 2. Two side locks, manual and hydraulic pins located on the port and starboard sides. 3. The hinges, 2 massive pivot points located on the upper deck level. For the engineers and maritime enthusiasts watching, here is the fatal data point. The Joint Accident Investigation Commission, JIC, later discovered that the visor's locking mechanisms were only designed to withstand a fraction of the forces they encountered that night. The design calculations for the Atlantic lock were based on static wave loads. They did not account for dynamic slamming, the explosive force of a ship moving at 14 knots hitting a 4-meter wall of water head-on. The disaster does not begin with a bang, but with a series of metallic thuds. Roughly an hour before the final plunge, passengers on Deck 1 and Deck 2, the levels closest to the waterline, report hearing unsettling noises. It sounds like a giant sledgehammer hitting the hull. The physics are simple and terrifying. Because the visor is not perfectly flush, a tiny gap exists. Every time the Estonia pitches into a wave, the visor lifts a fraction of an inch and then slams back down onto the hull. This creates a hammer effect on the Atlantic lock. Steel has a memory. It also has a limit. Under the relentless pounding of the Baltic, the steel eyes of the Atlantic lock, the brackets meant to hold the bolt in place, begin to undergo plastic deformation. They are stretching. The bolt is no longer just holding the door shut. It is being used as a pry bar against its own housing. On the bridge, the officers are blind. The MS Estonia was built with a fatal design oversight. The bow visor is not visible from the bridge windows. Furthermore, the electronic sensors designed to monitor the locks only tell the crew if the bolts are extended. They do not indicate if the steel housing around those bolts has failed. As far as the captain is concerned, the lights are green. The ship is secure. The mechanical fatigue reaches its zenith. At approximately 1:14 a.m., the Atlantic lock suffers a catastrophic failure. It doesn't just snap. The steel eyes are torn out of the deck plating entirely. Now, the 55-ton visor is flapping. It is held only by the 2 side locks and the upper hinges. This is the moment the big bang occurs, a sound so loud it wakes passengers across all decks. It is the sound of the side locks shearing off under a load they were never meant to carry. The visor is now a 55-ton pendulum swinging on its top hinges. As the ship's bow plunges into the next wave, the water pressure gets behind the visor. The force is astronomical. The hinges, located on the upper deck, are twisted like aluminum foil. As the visor tears away and falls forward into the sea, it performs one final, lethal action. The visor is mechanically linked to the inner ramp, the actual watertight door that keeps the ocean off the car deck. As the visor falls over the stem of the ship, it catches the top of the ramp, pulling it wide open. The helmet is gone, and the visor is open. The Baltic Sea now has a direct, unobstructed path into the heart of the ship. This is the start of the final 4 minutes. At a depth of roughly 157 feet, the depth of the seabed in this sector of the Baltic, the ship is still upright, but the car deck is flooding at a rate of 20 tons of water per second. For naval architects, this is the nightmare scenario known as the free surface effect. On a standard cruise ship, the hull is divided into watertight compartments. If one floods, The others keep the ship afloat. But a ro-ro ferry like the Estonia has a car deck that is a massive, open cavern. The moment water enters that flat, open space, the ship's stability is mathematically destroyed. The water doesn't stay in the center. It rushes to the starboard side as the ship rolls. This creates a terrifying feedback loop. The water shifts to the right. The ship heels further to the right. The lower the right side goes, the more water pours in through the open ramp. Within 120 seconds of the Visor's loss, the Estonia has developed a 15-degree list. On a ship of this size, 15 degrees is the threshold of catastrophe. On the bridge, the engines begin to fail as the oil pressure drops due to the extreme tilt. The ship is losing power, losing its orientation, and losing the battle against the physics of the sea. By 1:22 a.m., the MS Estonia is no longer a functioning vessel, it has become a drowning machine. The list has increased to 30 degrees. To visualize this, imagine trying to walk across a room where the floor is tilted as steeply as a playground slide. On the car deck, the situation is chaotic. The 20 tons of water entering every second has reached a critical mass. As the ship rolls to starboard, the weight of the water, now totaling hundreds of metric tons, concentrates on one side. This is the free surface effect in its most lethal form. In naval architecture, stability is the ship's ability to return to an upright position after being tilted by an external force. Because the water on the car deck is free-flowing, it moves faster than the ship can recover. It traps the vessel in a permanent, deepening tilt. At 30 degrees, the laws of gravity begin to dismantle the interior of the ship. In the galley, heavy ovens and refrigerators tear loose from their mountings, sliding across the floor and smashing into the starboard bulkheads. In the passenger cabins, furniture becomes unguided projectiles. For those trapped in their beds on the port side, the floor has become a wall, and the wall has become a floor. The list has now reached 40 degrees. This is a significant mathematical threshold for the MS Estonia. At 40 degrees, the lifeboats on the port side, the high side, become physically impossible to launch. The davits, the cranes meant to lower the boats, cannot swing outward against the extreme angle of the deck. They are pinned against the ship's superstructure by gravity. On the starboard side, the low side, the lifeboats are now too close to the water or are being smashed against the hull by the rising waves. Of the 10 lifeboats aboard, not a single one is launched successfully according to protocol. The evacuation has transitioned from a managed procedure to a desperate, every man for himself scramble for survival. The bridge crew finally manages to send the first Mayday signal at 1 hour 22 minutes and 19 seconds. But the transmission is fragmented. The ship's main engines have cut out because the lubricating oil pumps can no longer draw oil at such an extreme angle. The blackout occurs. The Estonia is now a dark, silent silhouette pitching in the waves, illuminated only by the flicker of emergency lights. At 1:24 a.m., the list exceeds 60 degrees. At this point, the MS Estonia is lying nearly flat on its side in the water. This leads to the second and final catastrophic influx of water. Until now, the water was primarily entering through the open bow ramp onto the car deck. But at a 60-degree tilt, the unprotected openings on the upper decks, windows, ventilation ducts, and companionway doors are submerged. The Baltic Sea begins to pour into the passenger accommodation decks. This is why the ship sank so quickly. Most ships that suffer a hull breach sink over hours. The Estonia sank in less than an hour because it flooded from the top down and the bottom up simultaneously. As the air trapped in the hull is forced out by the rushing water, it creates a terrifying whistling sound, reported by survivors, the sound of a ship exhaling its final breath. The stern, the back of the ship, begins to heavy up. Because the engines and heavy machinery are located toward the rear, and the bow is now partially buoyant due to the lost visor, the Estonia begins its final descent, stern first. The seabed where the Estonia rests is approximately 157 to 262 feet, 48 to 80 meters deep. As the stern hit the muddy bottom of the Baltic, the ship was still over 500 feet long. This means that for a brief, horrific moment, the bow of the ship was likely still protruding from the water while the stern was already resting on the seafloor. The pressure at 157 feet is roughly 5.7 atmospheres. For the hundreds of people trapped inside the air pockets of the cabins, the rapid sinking caused a massive increase in air pressure, leading to immediate barotrauma. The speed of the sinking, roughly 35 minutes from the first sign of trouble to total submersion, left no time for the human factor to compensate for the engineering factor. The failure of the Atlantic lock wasn't just a broken bolt. It was the first domino in a sequence of events that the crew was never trained to handle, and the ship was never built to survive. To understand why the MS Estonia sits at the bottom of the Baltic today, we have to move away from the deck and into the laboratory. The Atlantic lock was the linchpin of the ship's safety, a massive bolt designed to keep the bow visor secured to the hull. But under the forensic lens of the Joint Accident Investigation Commission, this lock was revealed to be a masterpiece of unintended inadequacy. The bolt itself was made of high-tensile steel, but the housing, the lugs, or eyes, that the bolt slid through was the true point of failure. Metallurgical analysis of the recovered visor showed that these lugs didn't just snap, they flowed. Under the repeated hammering of the waves, the steel reached its yield strength. This is the point where a material stops behaving like a spring and starts behaving like clay. As the Estonia hammered into the waves at 14 knots, the visor was exerting an upward and outward force of approximately 700 to 900 metric tons. The Atlantic lock was designed to withstand only a fraction of that dynamic load. The data-driven reality is that the locking system was under-engineered by a factor of 3. Each strike from a wave acted as a microscopic tear. By 1:15 a.m., the steel had work-hardened to the point of brittleness, and the final, massive wave simply shattered the housing. This wasn't just a freak accident. It was a static design applied to a dynamic environment. One of the most haunting aspects of the Estonia disaster is the information gap on the bridge. For the final 4 minutes, Captain Arvo Andersson and his officers were making decisions based on a reality that no longer existed. In the 1,990 seconds, Ro-Ro ferry bridge design prioritized aesthetics and forward visibility for navigation, but it ignored the mechanical health of the bow. The bridge was set too far back to see the visor. To make matters worse, the sensors on the bridge were binary. They were on-off switches. They indicated that the locking pins were in the extended position. What they did not indicate was that the pins were no longer attached to anything. At 1:17 a.m., when the crew heard the first massive metallic bang, they didn't realize it was the Atlantic lock failing. They suspected it might be a shift in cargo, a common occurrence in heavy seas. A seaman was dispatched to the car deck to investigate. He reported back that everything looked normal. Why? Because he was looking at the inner ramp. From the inside of the car deck, you cannot see the bow visor. The ramp appeared to be sealed. He couldn't see that, just inches of steel away. The visor was already hanging by a thread, ready to tear the entire ramp open. This lack of visual confirmation meant that the engines weren't throttled back until it was far too late. Had the ship slowed down at 1 a.m., when the first thuds were heard, the hydrodynamic pressure on the visor would have dropped by over 60%. The Estonia might still be afloat today. The MS Estonia was a roll-on, roll-off, row-row vessel. This design is the pinnacle of logistical efficiency but a nightmare for maritime safety. The car deck is a cavernous, unobstructed space running the length of the ship. When the visor fell and pulled the ramp open, the sea didn't just leak in, it surged. At a speed of 14 knots, the ship was effectively scooping the Baltic Sea into its own belly. The weight of water is roughly 1 metric ton per cubic meter. Within the first 60 seconds of the ramp being fully breached, an estimated 1,000 to 1,500 tons of water had flooded the car deck. This water created a sloshing effect. In physics, this is known as the free surface effect. If you hold a flat tray of water and tilt it slightly, the water doesn't just move, it rushes to the lowest corner, shifting the center of gravity instantly. On the Estonia, this shift was so violent that the ship heeled to 15 degrees in seconds. This angle is the tipping point. Once a ro-ro ferry tilts past 15 degrees, the water on the car deck becomes impossible to pump out, and the ship's natural buoyancy cannot counteract the weight. By 1:25 a.m., the list is 40 degrees. The ship is effectively paralyzed. The starboard side is so low that the sea is now entering through the ventilation ducts on deck 4. This is where the 157 feet becomes a grim reality. As the ship continues to tilt, it begins to lose its longitudinal stability. The stern, packed with heavy engines and fuel tanks, begins to sink first. The air trapped in the bow cabins is compressed with terrifying speed. Survivors who manage to reach the outer decks describe a scene of industrial horror. The ship was moaning. the sound of the internal bulkheads buckling under the weight of the water. At 1:30 a.m., the Estonia is on its side, 90 degrees to the water. The final plunge happened at 1:50 a.m. The ship didn't just sink, it vanished. It slid backwards into the dark, the bow being the last part visible before the Baltic closed over it. The vessel descended through the water column, hitting the seabed at a depth of roughly 157 to 260 feet, coming to rest on a slope of clay and sand. The tragedy of the MS Estonia led to the Stockholm Agreement of 1996. This was a turning point in maritime history. It mandated that all ro-ro ferries operating in Northern Europe must be able to remain afloat even with 50 centimeters, nearly 20 inches, of water on the car deck. It also ended the era of blind bow visors. Modern ferries now have redundant locking systems with load sensors, not just position sensors. CCTV cameras focus specifically on the bow locks and the inner ramp. The clamshell door design, which is significantly more resistant to head-on wave impacts. The MS Estonia remains a graveyard of the sea, protected by the Estonia Agreement, which prohibits any diving or salvage at the site. It serves as a permanent, rusted monument to the dangers of under-engineering and the unforgiving nature of the Baltic Sea. The failure at 157 feet wasn't just a failure of steel, it was a failure of imagination, the inability to imagine that the sea could be so powerful and our designs so fragile. For over 2 decades, the official version of the MS Estonia's demise was settled. The visor failed, the ramp opened, the water entered. But in 2020, a documentary film crew using a remotely operated vehicle, ROV, discovered something that the Joint Accident Investigation Commission, J, had allegedly missed or ignored. A 4-meter, 13-foot gash was discovered in the starboard side of the hull. This discovery sent shockwaves through the maritime community and the families of the victims. For years, conspiracy theorists had suggested that a collision or an internal explosion had caused the sinking. Now, there was physical evidence of a breach in the hull itself. This new data point forces us to re-examine the final 4 minutes with even greater forensic scrutiny. Did the hole cause the sinking, or was the hole a result of the ship's violent impact with the seabed at 157 feet? When a 15,000-ton vessel sinks, it doesn't drift gently to the bottom. It accelerates. The MS Estonia hit the seabed stern first, but as the rest of the ship settled, the massive weight of the hull pressed down onto the Baltic floor. The seabed in this region is not uniform. It consists of soft clay interspersed with erratic boulders, massive rocks left behind by receding glaciers. Structural engineers from Stockholm University have since argued that the 4-meter hole is consistent with deformation by contact. As the ship settled, a large rock beneath the mud likely acted as a punch, tearing through the steel as the ship's internal structures collapsed under the weight of the water. This is a critical distinction for the data-sensitive viewer. The hole doesn't necessarily mean there was a collision. It means the ship's final resting place was as violent as its final minutes on the surface. One of the most contentious pieces of data in the Estonia disaster is the position of the inner ramp. According to the original 1997 report, the ramp was pulled fully open by the visor. However, later dives revealed the ramp was nearly closed. How is this possible? If the ramp was closed, how did enough water enter to sink the ship in 35 minutes? The answer lies in the hydrodynamics of the scoop effect. Even if the ramp was only partially open, gaping by just a few feet at the top, the forward motion of the ship at 14 knots would have acted like a high-pressure hose. The water wasn't just leaking in, it was being injected into the car deck under immense pressure. Think of it like a car window cracked open while driving through a rainstorm at 100 miles per hour. The amount of water that enters is significantly higher than if the car were stationary. For the Estonia, the forward speed was its own executioner. If the captain had ordered an immediate, full astern, reversing the engines, the moment the first metallic bang was heard, the pressure on the ramp would have vanished. Instead, the ship continued to plow forward, forcing the Baltic Sea into its vital organs. For the older, data-focused demographic watching this, the most compelling evidence lies in the fracture morphology of the Atlantic lock. When steel fails, it leaves a signature. If an explosion had occurred, the steel would show petaling. The edges of the hole would be curled outward with microscopic evidence of high heat crystallization. but the fragments of the Atlantic lock recovered from the seabed showed ductile tearing. The steel had been stretched and pulled until it reached its breaking point, exactly what you would expect from mechanical overload due to wave impact. Furthermore, the side locks, the starboard and port pins, showed signs of shear stress. The pins were literally sliced in half by the visor's weight. This tells us that the visor didn't just fall off, it was pried off. The hinges at the top were the last to go, acting as a fulcrum that allowed the 55-ton visor to swing like a massive hammer, smashing into the ramp and the bulbous bow as it fell. The car deck of the MS Estonia remains one of the most dangerous places on Earth. It is a graveyard of 1,990 seconds technology. Volvo trucks, Lada cars, and cargo containers all tangled in a mess of steel cables and silt. But for the engineer, the car deck holds the final clue. The way the vehicles are piled on the starboard side confirms the free surface effect timeline. The vehicles didn't slide until the ship hit approximately 30 degrees. Once the first truck broke its chains, it created a bowling ball effect. A 40-ton truck sliding across a wet steel deck carries enough kinetic energy to punch through a secondary bulkhead. This cargo shift didn't just add to the weight on the starboard side, it physically damaged the internal structure of the ship, hastening the flooding of the lower decks. This is why the ship didn't just stay on its side, it inverted. The last minute of the MS Estonia was a scene of terrifying physics. The ship was now almost completely upside down. The four massive engines, which had been the ship's heart, were now a massive weight pulling the stern toward the depths. As the stern submerged, the air trapped in the bow was compressed so violently that it blew out the remaining windows. The buoyancy center of the ship vanished. At 1:50 a.m., the Estonia's radar signature disappeared from the screens of the nearby ferry, the MS Mariella. The ship descended through the water column at an estimated speed of 2 to 3 meters per second. When it hit the seabed 157 feet below, the impact was equivalent to a minor earthquake. The hull groaned as the pressure equalized, and the silt of the Baltic Sea, disturbed by the massive impact, rose up to swallow the wreck in a cloud of gray mud.